Hey, if you got a Bible, would you turn to Acts 23, or maybe you got a device, you can get it on there. It'll all be on the screen, but I still think it's good for us to read from the Word and kind of process things together. Today I want to talk to you about not losing your cool. Anybody here ever lost their cool? No. Does anybody want to stand up who is a parent and say, I have never lost my cool? I don't think so. No. Anybody here who's a teenager who says, I have never lost my cool? Never. I doubt it, okay? We all lose our cool every once in a while, and sometimes it comes because there are really intense situations that we find ourselves in, and we kind of fly off. I'm thinking this week about what's happening in our nation's capital with the Supreme Court nomination. I'm thinking about how every president gets one or two, usually, opportunities to nominate somebody to the Supreme Court. And of course, they nominate people that are tied into their ideology and their beliefs and everything. And I watched those nominations, and I've watched them over the years, and I've been amazed at how intense that can be when you're sitting in front of, I think it's 23 or 22, I think it's 23 United States senators, and you're being grilled about your life and your beliefs over and over and over again, and they're asking the same questions over and over and over again, and you've submitted yourself to investigation after investigation over and over again, and then you're there, and all the cameras are on you, and all the photographers are on you, and you're kind of there alone, as we've seen with the one that's going on right now. And now, this week's going to kind of be the pinnacle of that because of some things that have been brought out. And on Thursday, supposedly, there will be testimony and examination by these senators of the Supreme Court nominee as well as an accuser. And you just think about how intense that is. And you think about how easy it would be for somebody who sits up behind a table who gets elected from another part of the country, who is grilling you about your life and kind of pulling back the curtains and sometimes even making accusations. It would be so easy for you to lose your cool, wouldn't it? I mean, it would just be so easy to go, no, and to fly off. Or for me, it would be really easy to be sarcastic back and to look really bad and to make those who nominated me really bad. And this week on Thursday, I'm kind of a political junkie. I pay attention to that kind of stuff. So this week on Thursday, when they have all that stuff, I'll be gone. I'll be out of town that day. And so what will I do? I will record the whole thing. And I'll watch it later. I'll just watch it when I don't sleep or something like that. I just want to see how it all kind of plays out. And I think, man, what a demanding situation that is for anybody. And I've been on job interviews and been in front of churches and done different things like that. And those are hard. But if you could imagine how hard this would be. And yet here is the Apostle Paul now. We are entering into a phase of his life in which he is constantly on trial. As a matter of fact, he will have 5 different trials in the book of Acts, between Acts 22 and Acts 27, 28. And he'll stand before the Sanhedrin. He'll stand before a guy named Felix and be on trial. He'll stand before a guy named Festus, another governor, and be on trial. That's in Acts 25. And then before the king, Agrippa, he'll be on trial there in Acts 25 and 26. And then eventually he'll be on trial before Caesar. And he has all these trials, and they're going to peel his life back. And in this case, here where we're at today, chapter 22, the end of chapter 22 through 23, verse 11, we have this first trial that's happening. Now, back in the 70s, there was a guy who wrote a book about apologetics. Apologetics is the defense of the faith, and he wrote a book called Evidence Demands a Verdict. Maybe you remember Josh McDowell. And one of the things that's kind of the hinge of that book is a question that he asks, and this is it. If you went on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Now, I know that's really dated and it's way back there, but let me ask you this. What would be the evidence that people outside of the faith would look at your life and say, yes, they're Christian? that we could convict them of being Christian? What would be the things that you would lean into in your life? Would you say, well, I go to church every week, and so that must mean that I'm Christian? Do we really believe that everyone who goes to church on Sunday is a Christian? No, we really don't. But we kind of use that as our way of saying, well, I give this 2-hour period every week to God, and so I'm a Christian, and I'm going to be a believer. Or maybe if somebody were to look in your checkbook, they could see how your faith is reflected in your checkbook and your giving and your service to other people, but maybe they wouldn't see very much of that, and you'd wonder if there was much evidence to convict. Or maybe it would be what you watch on TV, or maybe it would be how you respond to suffering. People who are suffering around you, and you're struggling with that, and you want to do something about that, and that kind of declares your faith that you want to be a lot like Jesus. And that could be evidence that talks to you. One of the things that I think we really have to start thinking about more in this culture, as the culture becomes different than the way we are and what we believe, is does our worldview, does our view of what we believe and what is right and what is wrong reflect Christ's view, especially when it comes to sexuality, especially when it comes to personal beliefs, when it comes to all kinds of things that they're asking about rights and all the political stuff that goes on in our culture. And we're seeing a divide now between those who believe and don't, and those who are going to rise up who believe what God's Word says about things. You're going to end up standing out, and that's going to be evidence that would convict you maybe of being a Christian of sorts. Ultimately, you're not saved by any of those things that we just talked about there. You're saved by the blood of Jesus Christ, which was really brought to us well by Mark this morning, wasn't it? And about what it means to take communion and remember the blood and the sacrifice of Jesus. Well, Paul, when he gets into Acts 22 and actually Acts 18 and forward, Paul has two goals in his end of his life. He wants to go to Jerusalem and he wants to go to Rome. He wants to go and he wants to preach the gospel in Jerusalem, and he wants to go and preach the gospel in Rome. That's what his end of his life goals are and what he wants to do. And I've been thinking a lot about this in relationship to my parents and a little bit of end of life kind of issues, and I really see this kind of rise to the top. This is what Paul wants to do. He wants to preach the gospel in Jerusalem. And of course, you remember we talked about this over the last 2 or 3 weeks, how everybody close to Paul didn't want him to go to Jerusalem. Said, don't go to Jerusalem. Even Luke and all of his closest companions, the guy who wrote the book of Acts, was like, no, we begged him not to go to Jerusalem. And guess what? He went to Jerusalem. And guess what happened? Mobs of people came against him and wanted to take his life. And so we read in Acts 22 that the crowd listens to Paul, and eventually they rise up and they want to take him and tear him apart. A Roman commander comes in and says, I don't think we should do that. He wants to have him flogged, and Paul says, kind of in an interesting way, he says, do you always flog Roman citizens who haven't had a trial? That was in Romans 22, and that kind of stopped, or in Acts 22, and that kind of stopped everything dead in its tracks. And then we come upon this next trial here, and it's in Acts 22, verse 30. And I want you to look at this a little bit with me today. Now, when we talk about the Sanhedrin, and we talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about the Supreme Court of Israel. Okay? And so all these religious scholars now, and all these people, some who believed in the resurrection and some who didn't. Sadducees didn't, our text tells us, but the Pharisees, they could take or leave it. And they had a kind of a different way of thinking about things. They all come together and they want to put Paul on trial. And that's what's happening here. Now, before I get into reading the text, which we'll read together here in just a second, I want you to recognize a couple things. Number one, Paul was tired. How are you when you're tired? Are you cranky? Are you grumpy? Are you short with people? I always hated that description because I was short. It was like, what do you mean, are you short with people? Quit picking on me. You know, but now I know and understand, you know, some things just don't get out. And Pam said something to me recently, and I just said, stop yelling at me. And you know what? She wasn't yelling at me. I was just tired. And that's my go-to phrase. Don't yell at me, kind of a thing. How are you when you're tired? Well, Paul was tired, okay? He'd been traveling all this time, coming and going, and then trials and mobs and all these things kind of wore him out. And here's the other thing I want you to see before we read this is not only was Paul tired, but the people who were trying Paul were not interested in the truth at all. So you got a perfect combination here for an explosion, for something to happen. So read with me if you would. Let's start in Acts 20, verse 30, and the screen will pick up with Acts 23, verse 1. It says in verse 30 of 22, the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, so the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. So what you got here now is you got this Supreme Court that's going to put him on trial. And then he brought Paul and he had him stand before them. Obviously, the commander was no real friend of Paul's at all. He's kind of setting him up. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin. That would be Pharisees and Sadducees. And he said, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. And at this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing next to Paul to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there and judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. And all of a sudden you can see Paul kind of losing his cool, can't you? Temp's going up, he's turning red, veins are popping. He's got whacked on the side of the head. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Those who were standing next to Paul said, how dare you insult God's high priest? And Paul replied, brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it's written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. So all of a sudden there's this reticence about Paul, and he's kind of stepping back and going, oh, I should have done that. You ever done that when you lost your cool and thought, oh, I wish I could have those words back? Or I wish I could have that action back? That's what we're dealing with Paul here. And then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and that others were Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels or spirit. In other words, the Sadducees did not believe in anything in the spiritual realm. You had to be able to touch it and handle it, okay? Pharisees, they believed all those things. And it says there, but the Pharisees believe all these things. And then there was this conflict, and it says in verse 9, there was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? And this dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn into pieces by them. And he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring them into the barracks. And the following night, the Lord stood near to Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Now, what I thought about as I studied this week and kind of processed this is what do we need in our lives to not lose our cool? What do we need here? What can we learn from this passage that helps us to understand that we cannot lose control and do something kind of dumb? Paul did that. The first thing we have to have is a clear conscience. We have to have a clear conscience. Now, you may go back to chapter 23, and you may look at that where he says, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. And you may say, what? He was a persecutor of God's people. He drugged people out of their homes. He drugged people and threw them in jail, separated families, all these kinds. How does he have a good and a clear conscience because of that? Well, because he believed with all of his heart that he was serving God. I mean, he was deceived from it, but in his heart, all of that he did believing in his heart that he is serving God. You ever known anybody like that who maybe didn't live exactly the right way, but they thought this is the way God wanted them to live? I've seen lots of people like that over the years. And I bet it was a real struggle for Paul because he stands up there and he says, I have a clear conscience. Not only about what I'm doing now, but what I was doing before. And he goes on, and later in other trials, he talks about his conversion on the road to Damascus and all of that. But he says he has served the Lord even when he was persecuting the church. Acts 26:9 says, I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, that's what he believed in his heart, and that's what I did in Jerusalem, he says. And then he goes on in 10 and 11 of chapter 26. He says, on the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the Lord's people in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished. I tried them for being blasphemers, and I was so obsessed with persecuting that I even hunted them down in foreign cities. I mean, his heart was doing this for God, and many of them knew that. And then on the road to Damascus, of course, he met Jesus, and what did Jesus say to him? Why are you persecuting me? I mean, you're serving God, but you're persecuting me and the people of my belief. And so then he changed directions, and he went the other way. So what he was doing before his conversion, he did with a good conscience. And what he was doing since his conversion, when he was preaching the gospel, he did that with a good conscience as well. So in the heat of the battle, I think one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to examine our own hearts and ask ourselves, do I have a clear conscience about what I have done? And that can have so many applications in our life. I wish that I was like Paul and had that kind of confidence, that even when I wasn't a Christian, I believed I was serving God. I really didn't know at that time, and before I became a Christian at age 21, I was 21, I thought I was a Christian, and really I had a pretty good conscience about it. I was a good guy. I didn't do anything bad, and yet I was wrong. You see, you can have a clear conscience and be wrong too. And when you are confronted with the truth about any action in your life, one of the things that I want to call you and call myself to do is to step back and to look, is what I am doing right or is it wrong in the eyes of God? And I think the only way that you can answer that question is to be in the Word of God. Now you hear me say this all the time, and I'm just telling you. If you're in the Word, you have a path. What does the Bible say? That thy Word is a light unto my path. You have a path that's lit. And when you draw away from God, you'll find yourself kind of redirecting your life. And if the Word isn't part of your life, you're not always going to hit it right on your own at all. So I think the daily habit of reading the Word and reflecting on our lives is really important. And in those moments when our conscience is clear, the Spirit will speak to us through His Word, and we can start over with a clean conscience, and we can repent and be forgiven of that. But we need to have a clear conscience in our life because it reaffirms our commitment to Christ in the battles that we face. And we all face battles. We all face those intense moments. So, let me say this again. In the heat of the battle, you need to have a clear conscience. How do I have a clear conscience? Simple, basic, 101 stuff. Read the Bible. Spend some time every day in the Bible and let that kind of grow in your spirit. Here's the second thing. In the heat of the battle, we need a self-controlled mind. We need a self-controlled mind. Now, Paul may have had a clear conscience, and one of the things that I really like about what Paul does here is he says it twice in this speech to the Sanhedrin. He says, my brothers. He's trying to bring some sort of commonality to them. I'm part of you. And then he says, I was a Pharisee, and my descendants were Pharisees, so I know what this is all about, this Supreme Court stuff is all about. But then he gets smacked on the face. And it's kind of interesting that it's the high priest. So I don't know how you would feel if your preacher hit you in the face every time you said something wrong. I kind of have a feeling, though. I've never tried it at all. Doesn't mean I haven't wanted to, maybe, over the years, occasionally. Outside of an occasional tap on my face because I was being sarcastic from my mom, I've only been hit in the face one time in my life. And it was when I was in the 5th grade. I'd wanted to go out and play with some kids, and I went out and played behind our house with some kids. And my grandpa was up from Texas at the time, and he was staying with us. And I went out, and some kid bullied me around and pushed me around, and I got really mad, and I stomped off. And I went in and I told my grandpa. I said, Grandpa, he's not being nice to me and all that. You know what my grandpa did? He handed me a plastic bat. And he said, you go out there and you show them who you are. Now, I have a younger brother who is the big tough guy. And when I was in 5th grade, I was the little squirt. And I wouldn't have been able to fight anybody. But I took that bat. I remember it was yellow. And I took that bat out there, and that guy used that bat to beat me senseless. He did. He got it away from me, and he whacked me on the head, and he hit me and smacked me on the face and everything. And I remember running back to Grandpa and saying, this is what happened. And he was so disappointed in me. And he was just, why can't you be like your brother, kind of stuff. And I was like, I'm looking for something else here than a bat, okay? But here's Paul. He's on trial, and the high priest orders those next to him to smack him on the mouth. And Paul immediately reacts. And he says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Now, Jesus used that terminology, whitewashed walls, to describe Pharisees, but it wasn't in an angry way. You can feel the anger here, can't you? He is hot. He's tired. He's wiped out. And he says, God's going to get you for this. You've hit me in the face. And of course, somebody just happens to casually mention to him, you're talking about the high priest here. And all of a sudden, Paul pulls back. And Paul was contrite. And he backtracked and he said, I didn't realize he was the high priest. For it's written, don't speak evil about the ruler of your people. That comes from Exodus 22. I mean, Paul knew it inside and out. Now, when you're in the heat of a battle, maybe it's a spousal fight, or maybe it's one between you and your kids, or maybe it's a boss, or maybe it's somebody at church, and they say just the right things to do what? To push your buttons. And you know what? People that are closest to you, they know, don't they, what are the buttons that I can push to get a rise out of you and to blow you up. And if I were to take the time to take a mic around and ask some husbands, do you know what pushes her buttons? Yeah, he does. He won't say it, but he does. And the opposite is true too. Wives do that to husbands. So what do you need? You need self-control. You need self-control. Self-control is what saves your life from being pushed over the edge. Okay? It's where you restrain yourself. Some people have self-control or lose self-control, and they end up destroying their entire lives, don't they? They blow everything up. Other people just look bad. Some people have a lack of self-control, and it reflects bad on their reputation, or maybe the reputation of those around them. Maybe even the reputation of God. You see, if you go around and you're always saying, I'm a Christian and I believe in God and I love God with all my heart, but you don't have any self-control, some people are going to have a question about that. They're going to wonder about your temper. They're going to wonder about some of your actions in your life. They're going to wonder why you hit your preacher in the mouth, okay, which you didn't do. But they did about Paul. It's like, what are you doing here? And so, what do you do? Well, if you're going to be like Christ, one of the things you do is you pray for and develop self-control in your soul. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 says, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. He made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. When somebody's trying to push your buttons, a self-controlled person says, I will leave it to you, God, to deal with this. I am not going to respond to it at all. And you need to think, well, how do you do that? I mean, how do you have a clear conscience? You're in the Word. How do you have self-control in your life? There's a verse that Paul writes in Titus chapter 2 that I think gives us the clue to that. You stay in the grace of God. in the grace of God. Listen to what he says to Titus. He says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people, and it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present world." The grace of God is what builds self-control in our life. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and to say yes to self-control. You see, when you're constantly aware of God's grace in your life, if you get away from that, you're going to become undisciplined. You're going to become the person who flashes. You're going to become the person who gets angry, who sticks their finger out at people, who even goes off and does really dumb things in their life. But if you get close to the grace of God and you allow the grace of God to fill your heart, you know what's going to happen? You're going to have a self-controlled life. And that means that you're going to be close to Him and you're not going to react and retaliate. Instead, listen to the words again of 1 Peter, you are going to learn how to entrust yourself to Him who judges justly. Now, I think every job has people, positions in it that are hard. And if you're a boss of anybody, you probably have had those moments when somebody gets mad at you and you want to just thump them. It doesn't matter whether you're a preacher, whether you're a businessman, whether you're an engineer, or whatever it is. There are going to be some things that come along that are going to push your buttons, just like this happened with Paul. And it was really a physical thing. He struck him on the face. And Paul says, "Listen, you can't do that to me." He said, "Well, wait a minute, it's the high priest." And Paul was retaliating back with his words. And if there was anybody in the Bible who I think had a sharp tongue, it would have been Paul. I mean, he made his whole life around this. And you know, that's gotten me in trouble at times because this is what I do. I talk. And I can talk myself in and out and around almost anything. And I can talk myself around most of you. Not all of you, but most of you. Because I can just use those words. And you know what? A lot of times that gets me into trouble too. Because I'm not as self-controlled. And so I have to remember the grace of God in my life. Here's the third thing. In the heat of the battle, we need an encouraged heart. Paul has this trial, and the Sadducees and the Pharisees are quizzing him. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. And Paul just pushes their buttons then by saying that the resurrection is the only hope. And of course, all the Sadducees would say, that is not true. That is not right. Now, the Pharisees believed in that, but the Sadducees didn't. And all of a sudden, Paul's standing there, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees have a fight with each other. And it becomes a heated mob scene that was what Luke calls in verse 9, a great uproar. Some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this guy. Of course, the Sadducees found everything wrong with Paul, and he gets thrown back in jail. Now, wouldn't that be discouraging? I don't know about you. I think that would be really discouraging. And in the heat of the battle, we not only need a clear conscience, and we not only need a self-controlled mind, but we need encouragement. We all need encouragement. The power of encouragement. I read something not long ago, it's probably been 3 or 4 years ago, that I wish somebody would have told me way long time ago, that nobody ever quits because they're over-encouraged. Isn't that the truth? Nobody quits because they get too much encouragement. You don't quit your job because your boss says you're doing a good job all the time. You quit your job because your boss is saying you don't do good enough at all. And sometimes we have the opportunity to be an encourager when we're not. You know, parents, do you encourage your kids? I mean, do you make it a daily object of yours to say something encouraging to every one of your children? Let me tell you what, they're not getting encouragement anywhere else. Not steady diet of encouragement. If there's one place that a child should be encouraged, it's from their mom and their dad. And yet, you know, maybe by experience, I've seen it and experienced it as well, that sometimes the home can be the least encouraging environment. What about at work? What What about here at church? I mean, you blow in and you blow out. You go to class, you leave class, you serve with people and so forth. But when do you ever make it a point to encourage someone? To say, that was really good. To say to somebody who does a communion meditation, boy, that was awesome. That really spoke to me. Last week as I sat over here after being gone and with my mom all week and everything, and I was just out of it. I mean, I just was so tired. And the music set really spoke to me. And I sent a note to Micah and to Sam and to others. I just said, man, that music was perfect for me today. Thank you for that. When's the time that you've done that? And you've actually encouraged people at church? And a lot of times we can pick at things and we can say, well, this wasn't right and that wasn't right. And believe me, I'm the worst at this. I sit around and I pick at everything. And on the Sundays I don't preach, I have to go and pray after I don't preach, because what I've done is I've looked around at everything in the building and all the people, and I've said, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right, because I'm not focused on preaching. And I said, oh, I don't like this, and what am I going to do? And I pick on people. And yet, I've got to discipline myself that in the heat of the battle, everyone needs encouragement. Everyone does. And the right words at the right times can make all the difference. Look what the words were from Jesus. Now, what I love about this in Acts 23 is that this happened in Acts 18. Remember in Corinth? Do not fear. Do not be afraid. We talked about that 4, 5, 6 weeks ago. And then in verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. Be courageous. Don't give up. Don't stop doing what you're doing. You are mine, and I love you, and I will get you through this. But take courage. And you know, I love all the encouragement I get from you, but I really love the encouragement I get from God. It's always perfect, and it's always exactly what I need to hear. So let's be dispensers of encouragement, just as the example of Jesus to Paul is, take courage. And here's the last thing, and we'll wrap it up here today with this. In the heat of the battle, you and I, we need a sense of purpose about our future. We need a sense of purpose about our future. Jesus says to Paul, take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Remember what I said earlier in the sermon? The two things that Paul wanted to do? He wanted to go to Jerusalem, and he wanted to go to Rome. And these were deep-seated in his soul. I mean, this is where he wanted to go preach and what he wanted to do and all of these things. And he goes to Jerusalem, and it's nothing but battles everywhere he turns, and people want to kill him, and he gets thrown in jail, and he almost gets flogged, and he's on trial, and all of this stuff. And it would be so easy for him to say, that's it, I give up, I'm done. You ever been there? You ever been there where maybe you're in a class and the teacher keeps demanding more and more and more of you? Maybe it's a professor at college, and you're just like, man, I can't do this anymore. I quit. I'm done. And here's God who speaks into the soul of Paul, and maybe actually speaking into the soul of you today and saying, take courage. I'm going to give you a purpose for your future. You may be saying that about your marriage. You may be saying that about the parenting things that you're doing. Sometimes you may even say it about the church. I'm done with that church. I don't want to be at that church anymore. And God says, take courage. And you know, when 4 years ago, when things were kind of bumpy and not riding along very good, one of the things when I came here, I heard some of your own testimonies that you said, you know what? We just knew we had to stay in there. We just had to stay in there. Now, some people leave, and they leave for good reasons, and that's okay. But I'm thankful for those of you who stayed. And you're building something now, because we have a sense of a purpose for our future here at Cherokee Hills. I think this goes beyond just the words of encouragement. Jesus gave Paul a reason for his suffering. He said, you're suffering here in Jerusalem, but you know why? And here's what's going to happen now in the rest of the book. I'm going to send you to Rome. I'm going to send you to the place where you want to preach more than anywhere else. But it isn't going to look like you thought it was going to look like. You aren't going to ride in on a white horse. You're going to say, I'm going to save the world. As a matter of fact, you're going to go there on a ship. It's going to get shipwrecked, and you're going to end up in prison. And you're going to get to preach to the whole palace guard and everybody else, even though they're chained to your leg. And Paul might have said, well, I don't know if I like that idea or not. But you know what he was really saying? Jesus was saying, I'm going to give you what you want because it's what I want. And that is, I want the gospel preached in Jerusalem, and I want the gospel preached in Rome. And that's the purpose for everything you've gone through, and that's the purpose for everything you're going through. Some of you have gone to the doctor in the last year or two, and you've gotten a diagnosis that isn't very good. And maybe they've said you have cancer, and you can do these treatments. You've had those. And you know what's kept you going? I'll tell you what's kept you going. It's a sense of purpose about your future. It's those grandkids. It's a husband or a wife. It's your kids. It's the fact that you know that God can use the suffering in your life to bring glory to Him. And what do? You surrender to that. And you say, okay. And that's what Paul was doing here. And I think how important that was and how powerful that was. And Paul later writes to the Philippians, we're studying this on Wednesday night, and we studied this last Wednesday night, when he writes these words, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And as a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. You love that? You're sitting in a hospital getting transfusions of drugs to help fight disease in your life. You know what? You have an opportunity to let everybody know in that hospital, in that room, that you're here because you love Christ. And you want to live for Christ wherever He puts you. You may be in the worst job you ever thought you were in. And it may be hard to get up every day and go to work, and it may be hard to deal with some people at work, but you're in that place because God's put you there, and you have an opportunity to declare the glory of God in that place. Some of you are in schools and you think, I don't know why I have to do all this. It's an opportunity for you. All of these things are opportunities. And what Paul was most proud of when he wrote the Philippians, and by the way, he was in prison, in jail at the time, in a house arrest kind of a thing. And it says it's become evident, or it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard. And I think I said this Wednesday night, I'll say it up here again. Wouldn't you love to be the guy that got the assignment where you had to have yourself chained to the Apostle Paul? Especially if you didn't believe in God. I mean, Paul's going, I got a captive audience right here. Let's talk. I don't want to talk. No, let's talk. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, but they didn't have PlayStations or, phones or iPads or TVs or anything like that. What did those two guys do all the time? I'll tell you what, I know what they did. Paul talked to them about Jesus. And people became believers out of that. And the church at Rome began to spring up and became a powerful force. All because Paul surrendered to the purpose for his suffering, even when he was in jail, when Jesus said, you have testified about me in Jerusalem, and you are also going to testify about me in Rome. So what do you need when you're in the heat of the battle? I mean, what are the things that you can have to not lose your cool? One is you ought to try to live with a clear conscience. And the best way to do that is to be in the Word, so that you know what's right and wrong, and you adjust in your life to those things, and you try to stay on the path that pleases God. Another thing that you want to do is you want to have a self-controlled mind. And as we said earlier, and I'm just going to re-emphasize this, stay close to the grace of God. Because the closer you are to the grace of God in your life, and the closer you are to understanding how your life is unfolded with God's riches at Christ's expense, the more self-controlled you're going to be. And then not only receive encouragement, but give encouragement. And then tie all of that up with a sense of purpose about your future. And you know what? You're going to find out that you won't lose your cool quite as much. You'll process things a little bit better. And it'll be a more harmonious home. And it'll be a happy place at church. And it'll be a good place for you even at work. Because you don't lose your cool. Would you stand with me, please? Just bow your heads for a moment. I want you to think about those things. I think what I've given you today is very practical and hopefully draws you closer to God through the life of Paul. Paul's life was not perfect. Guess what? Your life's not perfect at all. You're going to make mistakes. Paul blows up. Then he has to backtrack. But he's always striving to live for God. And I hope that'll be the case for you as well this week. There'll be challenges. Somebody's going to push your buttons. Somebody's going to push mine. How are you going to respond to that this week? Father, would you help us to just lean into Paul's example here? Even in his failure, he still learned a lot, and then he showed a lot by allowing you and surrendering to you, not only with what he was doing in Jerusalem, but what he would do with the rest of his life in Rome. Help us, God, when we have somebody pushing our buttons. Help us to remember these things that are rolling around in our head right now. And to strive, God, to not lose our cool. But to provide evidence to others, even in how we handle it when we are attacked or when we're spoken against, that we don't retaliate, but we do what Jesus did and entrust ourselves to you who judges justly. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.